As I start writing this, it's 50 minutes past the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 2016, Remembrance Day in Canada. As the son of a veteran, I'm conflicted on this day. I want to honor my father's service to his country, but also I know that a conflict does not end with a peace treaty. It lives on for generations in relationships and descendants of those people affected by it. I know I'm just one of over 7 billion souls in this village of humanity, and I am not a great contributor to society. But if I can add something positive to it by sharing this video, then I guess I should. Maybe I'm sharing because I've started reading Conflict is Not Abuse, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair by Sarah Schulman. I don't know. I only know I'd like to share it. I know I promised as my next video a remake of an examination of the coalition of Western states. But with the election of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States, that seems unnecessary. Instead, I'm sharing Legacies. I wrote it in mid-October 1999 when several hundred fishing boats owned by non-First Nations fishers blockaded Yarmouth Harbor, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, in a protest against the Supreme Court of Canada's judgment in the Donald Marshall Jr. case. The Canadian Encyclopedia writes of Mr. Marshall, quote, in August 1993, after catching and selling eels near Antigonish, Nova Scotia, Marshall was convicted on charges of fishing out of season and without a license. That began a 6-year legal battle over First Nations treaty rights that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. In a landmark ruling reached in 1999, the court upheld fishing and hunting rights that the Crown had granted the Mi'kmaq Nation in a treaty signed in 1760. Unquote. I know that won't mean much to most of you, so I've added links regarding Donald Marshall, the decision, and the blockade of Yarmouth Harbor in the YouTube details. Legacies. I love the sea and I love this province. My forefathers were all from Yarmouth. Fevans, Durkee, Jeffrey, Foote, Yarmouth names all. The only grandparent I ever knew was my mother's mother, Mrs. Maud Durkee, née Jeffrey, of Overton, Yarmouth County. In 1922, at the age of 30, Gram was a single mother, widowed, living in her father's house with 2 young children, 3 brothers, Jim, Don, and Frank Jr., and a sister, Winnie. Her mother, having passed away, was left to Gram to tend house. She once told me how they lived, and looking back today, it reminds me of early industrial Cape Breton, the working man and his family, the company, and of course, the company store. As in Cape Breton, the wealth of the natural resources was controlled by a few. The Parker Akins Company of Yarmouth, with whom Graham's father dealt, had, by 1918, quote, a general store, a sawmill and woodworking plant at Metegan Station, Digby County, and a general store, fish curing branch, and lobster factory at Stanwood's Bar, Cape Breton, Yarmouth, employing in their operations a large number of men, unquote. Graham said they often worked just to pay off what they had put on account, with little money left over for the extras. Graham saved a 1941 newspaper clipping about her father, Frank Jeffrey Sr. It reads, last of the pioneer lobster fishing industry passes. The funeral of Frank Jeffrey took place at his home in Overton on October 2nd. At the time of his passing, he was 80 years and 3 months of age. He was the last of a group of 4 men who pioneered the lobster industry at Yarmouth Bar. The others were Frank Lent, Charlie Fevans, and Edgar Foote. These men worked in close association, following the fishing through its experimental stages to the time when it became one of the main industries of the province. As a group, they made their share of contributions to improvements in equipment and shipping practices. The 3 men last named were instrumental in the establishing of the herring trap at Yarmouth Bar. This became an institution and was for long a source of considerable profit to both operators and owners. Mr. Jeffrey never missed a lobster season for over 40 years. While carrying on this work, at which he was more than ordinarily successful, he built up his farm at Overton, and for the last 15 years gave his whole time to it. His outstanding characteristic was an enterprising and progressive outlook, and this he never lost. During the last few years, he carried out a successful diking project, reclaiming many acres of marshland. 4 years ago, at the age of 76, he started a cranberry bog, and this promises to be a success. His activity in these pursuits and his keen and comprehensive interest in current happenings never abated till the day he was stricken only 6 weeks ago. With his passing, not only is the last tie with the glamorous days of the lobster industry broken, but there goes from our midst a man whose industriousness, whose rugged and forthright character, whose friendliness and sympathetic interest in others won the respect and the admiration of all who knew him. The newspaper clipping had said, quote, "With his passing, not only is the last tie with the glamorous days of the lobster industry broken," unquote. Were there ever glamorous days? From what I know firsthand from working as a deckhand out of the ports of Yarmouth County and what I have read over the years researching my family's history, I doubt there was. In the fall of 1943, Graham's daughter, my mom, wed. My dad, at 21 years of age, had just returned several months earlier from Britain, having served in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Now, in civilian life, he worked at various jobs, Dominion Atlantic Railway and the Yarmouth Fruit Company, and at times fished with his father out of Yarmouth Bar. 2 years later, the young couple bought his father's boat. If the books for Amos Brannan, Dad's buyer, are still around, my father's name will be there, telling of a young family's life struggle to establish themselves. In those days, Sunday fishing was frowned upon, but Dad did go out one time, trying to get ahead. Upon his return to the wharf, a group of men were waiting. Fishermen, who had not served in the forces, threw bread at him and his boat. My father, having given nearly 2 years of his youth fighting in a war far from his home and taxing his soul by only how much only him and his God knew, was being shamed for breaking an unspoken tribal rule. In 1952, my father re-enlisted, this time in the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. Defense Medal, Canadian Volunteer Service Medal and Clasp, War Medal, 1939 to 45, United Nations Medal, Congo, ONUC, Canadian Forces Decoration. I was conceived in Edmonton, but born in Yarmouth in 1954, when Dad was stationed in Halifax. We also lived in Toronto and Wolfville during his military career, and returned to Overton, Yarmouth County, upon his retirement. Growing up, I had usually spent time during the summer at Graham's. It seemed to me that it was the place I was meant to be, so close to the water you can taste the air. The Jeffrey homestead in Overton was where I not only learnt of family and connectedness, but also the pain of leaving and of seeming not to belong. When I went along with Mom and Dad visiting family in the communities of Milton Highlands, Overton, the Cape, or Pembroke, their conversations amazed me. It seemed to me that this is where they belonged also. I grew up believing that only the sweat of Northern Europeans had built Yarmouth, and the only reason for its decline was the end of the age of sail. In the schools of Wolfville, I had learned of the Acadian expulsion, but not of their current culture on the North Shore or the Pamlicos. I learned of the American Civil War, but not of the struggles of Nova Scotians of African descent. And I learned of Micmac Indians, but not of the Mi'kmaq people. My perception of Yarmouth started to change when I began attending school at Yarmouth High, where there were students from other communities, and I soon discovered other cultures, Mi'kmaq, Acadian, African Canadian. The Donald Marshall decision of the Supreme Court of Canada has made me look again at who I am and how I view my country. Just as the toxic tar ponds of Sydney are an environmental legacy of our past, the toxin of institutionalized racism is a social legacy. Just as we cannot expect the residents of Frederick Street to bear the burden of dealing with the tar ponds, we cannot expect the fishers of Yarmouth of European descent to bear the burden of dealing with the toxin of racism. It is up to us as a nation how we confront our past, and now is the time to show the world what Canada is about. The Canada my father stood for when he went to the Congo as part of the United Nations peacekeeping force in 1961. In 1939, Canada asked its young people to put aside their dreams and aspirations so that Nazi Germany could be defeated. Today, Canada needs the same commitment from Canadians so that the same evil does not grow in us. As long as we allow tragedies such as the Acadian deportation, the residential schools, or the destruction of Africville, all Nova Scotians will be prisoners of their prejudices.